And the U.S. says that it is now imposing a naval blockade of Iranian ports. Trump has warned that Iranian ships that come close to the U.S. blockade will be immediately eliminated. Earlier, the U.S. military said that the blockade would be enforced against vessels of all nations entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas. And it includes all of Iran's ports on the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. In response, Iran has threatened retaliation against ports of its Gulf neighbors. The escalating threats have unsettled oil markets, renewing concerns over global energy supplies. Military analyst Marina Miron joins me now from Munich. Marina, the U.S. military, as we've heard, is saying now that it will begin this blockade of ships leaving Iran's ports. How do you see this move now strategically?
Good afternoon. Yes, that's correct. U.S. Central Command is going to enact this blockade. What is important to say here is that it's not a blockade in a classical sense of a naval blockade. What we're talking about here is more of a maritime interdiction, meaning that the Strait of Hormuz will remain open or partially open, with the U.S. naval assets most likely operating from the Arabian Sea, away from any potential dangers from the northern part of the strait, which is the Iranian coast. In terms of strategic significance here, it is debatable how well the US can execute this blockade and how long it can do so on its own, because we know that the UK, Australia, and other European countries have said that they wouldn't join the US efforts to create this blockade. Therefore, it remains questionable how effective this blockade will be in the long term, because this is exactly the scenario that Iran is preparing for. And Iranian voices within Iran, there are pro-establishment voices that are saying that this will not lead to anything good and will increase the oil prices, and Iran is ready for that. Plus, there will be a counter move by Iran. Others are worried about the prices, the economy in Iran itself, and how this might affect Iranian economy, and the fear that this might lead to a complete collapse. So the strategic logic of this blockade, quote unquote, is to force Iran to open the strait on the US terms by targeting its economy and its export potential of oil.
And Marina, tell us, because we have, against that backdrop, we have NATO allies, Britain and France, saying that they would not be drawn into the conflict by taking part in the blockade. How do you assess the U.S. capacity now to execute on what it promises to deliver?
Well, in terms of maritime interdiction, there is little known in terms of what the U.S. is going to do. There have not been any details disclosed. The U.S. has, of course, destroyers in the region, which it can use for naval interdiction. I doubt that the U.S. will use missiles. It might threaten to use missiles against oil tankers, but because of the environmental damage and other disadvantages of doing so, I don't think that this will be the case. It will be more of an operation to reroute vessels. So most likely, there will be teams armed teams sent to those tankers to basically to interdict them. That can be carried out, but how many tankers are going to be passing at the same time, or how many tankers can the U.S. take on? So there are many details which are not clear. So different scenarios have to be taken into consideration to see how successful it's going to be, and what if these vessels refuse to change course. So will the U.S. then use heavier weapons? The other issue is mine clearing, and that is one capacity that I can say the U.S. cannot do on its own. Even Iran itself has no control over its sea mines, as some sources suggest. So it's quite a complicated operation, has nothing to do per se with a blockade, rather with a clearing of the strait. And that is something that the U.S. would need allies to help with.
Okay. And in the meantime, we have to say from the Iranian side, a military spokesperson has called the U.S. restrictions on international shipping, and I'm quoting here, piracy. They have said that if Iranian ports are threatened, that no port in the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman would be secure. How are you reading that threat? What is the Iranian regime now capable of?
Well, what we have to understand is that Iran doesn't have to have a functioning navy in order to deny access. This is not about matching the US naval capacity. It is about the ability to deny access using drones, using small, fast attack vessels, which Iran still has. And it's also about the proxy network, and some Iranian sources, as well as Chinese and Russian sources, suggest, whether it's true or not, is that Iran is threatening to close Bab el-Mandeb through the Ansar Allah, through the Houthis, and that would be quite a complicated matter, especially considering the current oil prices, because we have seen that the Houthis are capable of disrupting logistics in that area, affecting everything going from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal. So it's quite a strategic choke point. And when the Houthis did it last year, the US and allies were not very capable of doing anything about it. And therefore, if that happens, that would be a strategic move by Iran, aside from other things that the Iranian side can do in terms of using drones, as I said, using small attack boats, attacking other ports in the Gulf region. So there are quite a lot of tools in the toolbox that Iran still has at its disposal that can be used for this denial and exhaustion strategy.
Marina Miron, thank you so much. Now, Trump also told reporters outside the Oval Office that Iran called and wants to make a deal very badly.
Has the blockade started, sir?
Yeah, started, 10 o'clock. I can tell you that we've been called by the other side. They'd like to make a deal very badly, very badly. We can't let a country blackmail or extort the world, because that's what they're doing. They're really blackmailing the world. We're not going to let that happen.
And let's speak now with Middle East expert Daniel Gerlach. He's editor-in-chief of Zenith Magazine. He's joining me from Berlin. Welcome back to the program, Daniel. We just heard Trump talking about Iran blackmailing the world, but he also says that they want to, quote, make a deal very badly. What do you make of Trump's messaging?
Well, look, trying to analyze and rationalize Trump's messaging is actually not the task of a Middle East expert, because it's always confusing. It often doesn't make sense, but you know, it's at the same time logical for him, because he doesn't want to continue the war. He doesn't want to continue the fighting. At the same time, he wants to apply maximum pressure, and he wants to show to his constituents that he's doing something. So what would he do? He's actually doing something that I expected him to do earlier in the onset of the conflict, of the war. Instead of going in with the Israelis and bombing Tehran and other cities, I thought they would rather go after the oil assets and try to stop Iranian oil shipping to China. Now, this counter blockade that he is implementing or talks about implementing is some sort of an equivalent to a blocking mechanism which exists in other parts of the world, which means, like, if you comply with certain sanctions or restrictions, then I will impose sanctions and restrictions on you for your compliance with it. This is a bit like fighting fire with fire. And so I don't think that it's absolutely rational to continue these negotiations. And I think they were on a certain kind of a good path. However, it's not surprising that after 24 hours of negotiations, they cannot achieve something that hasn't been achieved over many years.
When you look at this strategically, how risky do you think that such a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz might be for the U.S. and for the region?
It is highly risky because at one point you would have to enforce the blockade. And blockade doesn't mean, it means it's actually keeping the straits open by imposing a blockade is a bit counterintuitive. But what the Americans have announced to do is that they would prevent ships from complying with the Iranian regulations, policies, blackmail, whatever you want to call it, from going from mooring at the Iranian ports and then paying a toll, or in a way like complying with the Iranians, and then past the Strait of Hormuz. For those ships, the Americans want to impose countermeasures. At one point, if you want to implement it, which means enforce it, it means that you have to send actual naval assets into the straits and into the Strait of Hormuz. And there you expose yourself, of course, to Iranian mines, Iranian missiles, which they can fire quite easily from the mountains next to the shore. So what we have seen at the same time, the Iranians have been firing in all directions, and they have been attacking Gulf states and their neighbors, but they have caused a surprisingly low number of American casualties, maybe because they weren't able to, because the Americans intercepted everything, or because they knew that the moment they kill American servicemen, that would put them into a very bad position, because then America would go full in and would take revenge. Maybe that's the Iranian logic behind it. I cannot tell you for the moment. I'm not sure that Iran in such a situation would try to avoid a military escalation with the Americans, but they can also not afford to back off.
Talk with me a little bit more about the Iranian side of this, because, I mean, Trump seems to try and hit Iran hard economically with this blockade. Can the Iranian regime withstand this sort of economic pressure when we're talking about, pressure on its oil revenue? I mean, they have withstood sanctions over multiple years. They have withstood now, a wiping out of much of their leadership. How much more can they take?
Well, but in a way, you've given the answer yourself, which means, like, after all they have been able to fend off and to withstand, they would probably be able to withstand a couple of weeks of more sanctions or a blockade of the oil exports. But they would certainly make everyone else pay for it too. And we have seen what this means. Now, it's very difficult to assess the Iranian leadership in this situation, because I think at the same time they don't want to block the way for compromise and negotiations, because they see a historic opportunity in it. On the other hand, they tend to overplay their hand and overestimate their position, because they are so full of historical determinism and believe that America is doomed and the American empire is failing, and Trump is just like one of the phenomena of this demise of the American empire. So they tend to overestimate their capacity also. On the other hand, don't forget that in addition to the Strait of Hormuz, there's another strait which the Iranians have a hand on, which is the Bab el-Mandab, the entrance of the Red Sea, which is another choke point of global economy. There you have the allies of the Iranians, the Houthi militia. They are you cannot switch them on and off as you please. They're not exactly stooges of the Iranian regime, but they're allies of the Iranian regime. And the fear that the Iranians might escalate at that strait would, of course, jeopardize the global economy. And I think everyone who is involved in this, including the Gulf states, has that very much in mind.
What do you think is going on right now in the capitals among Gulf states? Can you give us a bit of a window into how, because Trump has very much, and Netanyahu as well, have very much been the first movers when we look at, the operations within Iran. Yeah. What do you think those behind the scenes conversations that leaders in the Gulf are having with the American president specifically right now? That's
a very difficult and a very sensitive question. I'm not sure that at the moment everyone is looking desperately to America. It looks to me as if at least some of the Gulf states had been, trying to deal on their own behalf, independently from each other, and make arrangements to make sure they get out of the line of fire. There are in particular two or three Emirates or three Gulf states that have been severely hit. One of them is Kuwait, which is actually strongly, not anti-Iranian at all, but of course hosts a large number of American troops and military bases. The others are Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And in particular, the United Arab Emirates are, I think, afraid of being left alone with the Iranians in the Gulf because they have a very problematic relationship with Tehran. So I think at the moment everyone is trying to make their own deals and do not hope for a deus ex machina coming from Washington.
Daniel Gerlach, it's always great to get your insight. Thank you so much for your time. Daniel Gerlach from Zenith Magazine.
And joining me now here in the studio is Gordon Robison. He's a journalist and analyst with years of experience working in and writing about the Middle East. He's lived in Amman, Jordan, Cairo, Egypt, and in Saudi Arabia. He's now here in the studio here in Berlin with us. Gordon, it's good to have you with us. After the talks with Iran and Islamabad failed over the weekend, U.S. President Trump said he didn't care. He said he knew that the talks were not going to work. So what was the point?
I think that's the question almost everyone's been asking themselves for the last couple of days. One could also argue that if the talks had succeeded, and I want to be clear, I think the chances of that were always extremely slim. But if the talks had succeeded, I'm sure that President Trump would also have said that he always knew that Iran would come around to America's point of view.
So help us make sense then of what is happening right now. The United States, the president, has ordered a blockade of the blockaded Strait of Hormuz.
Right. So the short answer is, I think almost everybody doesn't quite know. As your question hints, blockading something that's already blockaded, how exactly would that work? I mean, much more specifically. So what it seems the Americans are trying to do is to counter the widely reported tolls that Iran has been levying on ships to allow them to transit the strait. But there are a bunch of problems with that. First and foremost, like, how do the Americans know which ships have actually paid the Iranians, especially since the Iranians are demanding that the tolls be paid in cryptocurrency or occasionally Chinese renminbi? So, how do they get around ships that might reflag? By most reports, there are still mines in the strait, which is why the Iranians have made the ships that have paid the tolls take a slightly unusual, unusual route very close to Kish Island. The American Navy isn't going to go in there because that's like literally right off the coast of Iran. And this is probably the biggest thing. So what's going to happen if the American Navy decides it wants to board, let's say, a Chinese ship?
Right.
I mean, it's hard to imagine that the U.S. military or the people around President Trump would really want to cause that sort of an international incident. I suppose we're just going to have to wait and find out.
Well, we know that President Trump, he didn't really consult many allies. There was really not a big effort at coalition building before this war started.
I'd say that's fair.
But I'm wondering what's going to happen, though, as a result of this blockade by the U.S. Is it actually going to give the U.S. president something that we know he doesn't like to deal with, and that is some type of coalition of the willing, if you will?
I kind of doubt that it will. I think what we've seen on the part of most European powers is they're trying to volunteer to do the absolute minimum to stay on the right side of the Trump administration without actually committing to doing very much. You saw this with Keir Starmer and the British, who said that they would be willing to help out with mine clearance, but nothing else.
Yeah, but we do see the UK and France saying that they're going to co-host an international conference later on this week, maybe early next week, where the aim is securing the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, and it's going to be an international conference. So that looks like coalition building to me.
Right. Well,
what do you think is going to happen?
It does. On the other hand, I've seen no indication that the Iranians or the Omanis, who keep getting left out of this conversation, but they do control the other side of the strait, no indication that they're going to be at this conference. I mean, the whole thing has a kind of feel of people wanting to be seen to be doing something, even though it's not going to amount to much.
How do you explain the fact then that Oman, which controls the other part of the Strait of Hormuz, that it almost never appears in any discussions about this situation?
Well, partly because that's how the Omanis want it. The Omani approach to diplomacy has always been to be very low-key, to be very quiet. Omani officials sometimes like to refer to themselves as the Switzerland of the Middle East. Also, however, the Omanis are feeling a little bit burned. Recall that the Omanis were mediating between the Americans and the Iranians right before the war began at the end of February, and in fact, they were scheduled to host another round of talks just a day or two later. So characteristically, they have said very little in public, but it would be astonishing if the Omanis were not feeling that they had to kind of put all of this a bit at arm's length.
There's been confusion about Lebanon in this whole equation about whether or not it was included in the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran. Putting the confusion aside, if Iran does not back down, will the Israelis have no choice? Will they have to fall in line, and will they have to cease any attacks on Lebanon in order to keep the United States on their side?
I don't think the Israelis will have to fall in line, partly because I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu feels he has to do much of anything. He clearly believes that when the chips are down, he can get the Americans to back him up no matter what. Now, whether that's actually true is a separate discussion, but he clearly believes that. The Israelis have scaled back their operations in Lebanon a bit over the last few days, but there's no indication that they've given, certainly in what people are saying domestically, Israeli officials are saying domestically, that that's going to be anything more than a short-term favor to the Trump administration.
So we've talked about the Israelis, the Omanis, we talked about the United States. What about the Iranians? I mean, this blockade on their blockade. What kind of pressure, if any, does this put on them?
Well, probably not all that much. I mean, the alignment of forces that we had back on February 27th, the day before the war began, is still basically the same. That for all the bombing, for all the degrading of their Navy, their Air Force, all of the destruction in Tehran, which I don't want to sound like I'm minimizing, because I'm not, but from the regime's perspective, its own survival is in effect a win. They've still got control of their nuclear materials, even if they may be buried under a mountain at this point. And the regime has shown itself to be extremely resilient. You know, the top level and then the second level and then arguably the third level of officials were taken out by the Americans and the Israelis, and other people smoothly rose to take their place. And there's no indication that another series of strikes taking out people would change that scenario.
Do you see this conflict ending sooner rather than later? I mean, because there's this feeling among many commentators at the moment that we are watching the beginning of yet another forever war for the United States in the Middle East.
I think that is possible, but at the same time, I think President Trump does not want a forever war. And we may not see the conflict end, but we may see it kind of peter out, where both sides are able to claim some sort of victory.
Before the midterm elections in November?
Well, midterms are a long way away. I think President Trump wants this off his agenda a lot sooner than that.
Okay. Gordon Robison, it's good to have you in the studio. We appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.